making of a Space Marine is not a story of glory, but of destruction. 30 boys were taken from a single hive world, fed into a system that broke their bodies and rewired their minds over the course of years. One of those survivors would later stand in a ceremonial chamber, handed an ancient bolt pistol, and be ordered to execute an unarmed fellow warrior standing 5 meters away. What the Brotherhood revealed to him afterward should have been devastating, but the boy who would have cared about that kind of detail had been erased long before the trigger was pulled. His story was not unusual because it was the system working exactly as designed. For 10,000 years, the Imperium of Man has fed children into a machine that produces the most powerful warriors the galaxy has ever known. Soldiers who defend a species they can no longer belong to and fight for a humanity they can no longer feel. The process that creates them, from the first failed experiment in gene forging to the enhanced warriors of the 41st millennium, carries a cost so total that even the Astartes themselves cannot fully measure what was taken from them. The survivor's journey started long before he was ever taken from his world, with a mistake made 10,000 years earlier. Long before the first Space Marine ever set foot on a battlefield, there existed an earlier breed of warrior, one that was stronger, more savage, and far more dangerous than anything the galaxy had seen. They were called the Thunder Warriors, and the Emperor of Mankind created them for one reason: to unite a broken Earth by force. But their story did not end in glory. This is the full story of how Space Marines are made, what it costs, what it breaks, and what it leaves behind. Chapter 1. The First Mistake. To understand why the Thunder Warriors were built, you first had to understand what Terra had become. During the final centuries of the 30th millennium, Terra was not the seat of a great empire, but a ruined wasteland. The book Valdor, Birth of the Imperium described the planet as a world torn apart by the Age of Strife, a long period of total collapse that had left the community cut off from its colonies and fighting over scraps. Warlords and tech bandits carved the world into territories, while warfare poisoned the landscape with chemical weapons and twisted the population with things that should not have existed. Creatures and dark powers born from pure desperation. Even before the Thunder Warriors, the Master of Mankind had experimented with rougher forms of enhanced soldiers, fighters sometimes called techno-barbarians, a rough first attempt at creating warriors strong enough to survive in a world that was dangerous. But those early creations were not enough. To pull Earth back from collapse, the Lord of Terra needed something far more powerful. He created the Legiones Contagious as his primary weapon for the campaign that would become known as the Unification Wars. These fighters were massive, physically overwhelming, and designed to crush anyone who stood against Terra's new ruler. For a time, they did exactly that, tearing through the warlords of Old Night with speed and savagery that no ordinary army could match. They tore down fortresses, crushed anyone who fought back, and forced entire continents to surrender. Their greatest champion, a warrior named Eric Tyrannus, who later earned the title Lightning Bearer, became a legend in his own right, famously raising the banner of lightning at the Declaration of Unity. But a problem had been built into these warriors from the very start, one that their creator understood better than anyone. The first super soldiers were mass-produced using gene science that was still rough and poorly understood. The novel described them as powerful but unstable weapons whose genetic code had not been designed to last. Their blood sometimes turned against their own arteries, and their organs would begin to consume themselves from the inside. Many lost their minds during long campaigns, cracking under the pressure of their own failing biology or the horrors they faced in battle. Once set loose on a target, these warriors were nearly impossible to pull back, often turning what should have been a clean military operation into pointless slaughter. One recorded example was the destruction at the Citadel of Mal and Sen, where the fighting went far beyond any military goal and became something closer to a massacre for its own sake. Their raw physical power was beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen. Some among them could reportedly knock down the Azurite Tower with their bare hands, a feat that even the warriors who replaced them would struggle to match. Constantine Valdor, the man who would become the Captain General of the Master of Mankind's personal guard, summed up the problem in clear terms. He called these fighters weapons with a limited lifespan, designed for the specific crisis of unification and nothing that came after, and the fighters themselves knew it, which made them reckless, pushing them to take enormous risks because they understood their time was short. Some began acting as though they answered to no one, forming what the text called a separate power within the Imperium's own borders, a force that obeyed its own rules rather than those of its creator. The book The Outcast Dead supported this from a different angle, through the eyes of the Lightning Bearer himself. That novel confirmed that while the Legiones Contagious were physically stronger and possibly faster than the warriors who later replaced them, their bodies had been built to win one planet, not conquer an entire galaxy. By the time of the Horus Heresy Era, thousands of years after their supposed extinction, the few Thunder Warriors who had somehow survived were falling apart. Tyrannus himself suffered from rotting flesh and organ failure, surviving under the alias Babu Dakal as a gang lord in the slums of Terra, needing constant and desperate medical treatment just to stay alive. Their minds were described as a rough mix of aggression and growing madness, good enough for killing, but completely unable to serve as a lasting military force. Every one of these warriors had been built with gene science that pushed the human body far past its natural limits, and the cost of that push was a slow countdown built into their bodies. Their bones grew too fast, and their muscles burned through nutrients at a rate their bodies could not sustain. Chemical treatments that kept them fighting also slowly poisoned them, and the psychological shaping that made them fearless in battle also stripped away the mental controls that kept a person stable. They were, in every sense, a short-term solution to a long-term problem, and by the time the Unification Wars were ending, the Master of Mankind had already begun planning their replacement. So he made his decision. Official Imperial history claimed that the first super soldiers died as heroes in the final battle of the campaign at a place called Mount Ararat, a glorious last stand where these legendary fighters gave their lives to finish the job they had started. But the actual account told a very different story. As revealed in the same publication, the truth about that final battle had been carefully hidden behind a constructed myth. A high-ranking official named Uoma Kandawire investigated the site and found evidence that tens of thousands had died in what appeared to be a senseless display of force, not a battle against any outside enemy. The Legiones Contagious were not killed by their enemies, they were killed by the Emperor's own forces. Valdor and the Custodian Guard carried out the massacre, wiping out the warriors who had won Terra's unification so that a new, more stable army could take their place. Surviving members of the First Breed, led by the Primarch Ushotan, understood what was happening. They realized they were being erased because they had become disposable. Captain General's reasoning was simple and brutal. Laws and ideas about innocence did not matter when weighed against the survival of the species. These warriors had been built for a single purpose, and once that purpose was done, they were removed. What replaced them became the Adeptus Astartes. Where the Thunder Warriors had been barbarian kings with no real loyalty beyond the moment, the new breed of super soldiers were designed as line troops. Standard, collectively deadly, and acting with steady, machine-like destruction. They were meant to be produced in batches like reliable weapons, rather than unleashed like wild animals. At their very first engagement, someone called them Angels of Death, a name that stuck permanently and followed them across 10,000 years of war. The difference came down to biology. The first breed had been created through rough, fast gene science that forced the human body into shapes it could not hold for long. The new warriors would be built through a slower, more careful process that worked with the body's own growth, rather than against it. Where Thunder Warriors received their enhancements all at once and suffer the consequences of that rushed approach, the new warriors would receive their implants over a period of years, each one carefully timed to match the natural development of the host. The result would be a warrior who was not just strong, but able. Not just fierce, but controlled. Not just effective in the short term, but able to fight for centuries without breaking down. But even this improved project faced a crisis early on. The Master of Mankind had created 20 Primarchs, genetic templates meant to anchor the new legions and keep their gene line stable. These 20 creations were scattered across the galaxy by forces unknown before they could fulfill their role. Without them, the lead scientist of the project, Amar Astartes, believed that the new legions would eventually suffer the same sickness that had destroyed the First Breed. She became so convinced of this that she attempted to destroy the entire project in the Lord of Terra's underground laboratory, known as the Dungeon, choosing destruction over what she saw as a repeat of the same failure. Shifting from the Legionis Contagious to the Astartes was not an upgrade born from ambition. It was a correlation born from failure. The first attempt at gene-enhanced warriors had given the Imperium a united planet, but at the cost of creating an army too broken and too dangerous to survive the peace it had won. The new warriors were the answer, but they carried their own risks that would not become clear until the galaxy itself was burning. And those risks began with the very thing that made them possible, the 19 organs that turned a human child into a weapon of war. Chapter 2. The Gene Seed Blueprint. What separated a Space Marine from the Thunder Warrior who came before him was not just strength or discipline, but design. Every battle brother in the Imperium of Man carried inside his body a set of 19 genetically engineered organs, each one serving a specific function, each one working with the others to turn a human teenager into something far beyond human. This system was called Gene Seed, and without understanding how it worked, the Astartes looked like myths or miracles, but they were neither. They were structured biological machines, and the design that built them was both the Imperium's greatest achievement and its most fragile resource. Gene Seed was a general term used for the entire collection of genetic material, microorganisms, and engineered organs that together made a battle brother what he was. The Codex Space Marines described it as a Brotherhood's single most valuable possession, a biological inheritance shared by every warrior, made up of specifically grown genetic material and organs that trace their origin back to the greatest creations of the Master of Mankind, the Primarchs. In a very real sense, the blood of these 20 genetic sons flowed through the veins of every battle brother who had ever lived, much like what one source compared to old world blood magic, similar to vampire bloodlines, where the sons inherited both the powers and the curses of their father. That inheritance connected every warrior to his brotherhood, his Primarch, and the Golden Throne itself, forming a chain of replication that stretched back 10,000 years, and every break in that chain meant warriors who would never exist. Turning a human into one of the Astartes began with youth, and for very specific reasons. Candidates were always chosen as teenagers, typically between the ages of 10 and 16, because their bodies still needed to be developing in order to accept the foreign genetic material. Each implant was key to the body's natural growth hormones, which meant that a fully grown adult body would almost always reject them. Rare cases of older recruits, sometimes up to the age of 20, often resulted in incomplete changes and warriors who could not receive the full set of enhancements. Some brotherhoods took recruits even younger, as early as 6 years old, while others like the Space Wolves waited until candidates were in their late teenage years. Adults undergoing the transformation were extremely rare, though it had happened. The Jarls of Fenris, the men who had fought beside the Primarch Leman Russ before his true nature was known, all volunteered for the process. Russ warned them that it would most likely kill them, but their loyalty to their king was so strong that they refused to turn away. Only a handful of them survived, later becoming known as the Greybeards within their legion. Before any surgery began, candidates underwent intense screening for tissue match and mental fitness. Those whose bodies or minds could not work in harmony with the implants faced death or madness. Physical surgery was also supported by chemical treatments and a process called hypnotherapy, designed to shape the mind and balance the warrior's new and dangerous body chemistry. These warriors were also rendered unable to have children as a result of the transformation, making the gene seed itself the closest thing they had to reproduction. There was an important difference between how the Astartes were made and how the Custodian Guard were created. The Custodians had every enhancement grown within them at the genetic level, woven into their DNA from the very beginning, making each one a unique masterwork. The Battle Brothers, by contrast, received their enhancements through artificial organs that were grown separately and then surgically placed inside them. This made the process faster, more repeatable, and able to produce warriors on a much larger scale, but it also meant that rejection, failure, and mutation were constant dangers. 19 implants were introduced in a specific order. often grouped together for efficiency, and each one changed the body in a different way. Surgeries required to place these organs were painful and deeply involved, particularly those affecting the brain and nervous system. Many required the candidate to stay awake during the entire procedure with no pain relief because the surgeons needed constant feedback to make sure the implant was taking hold correctly. At age 10 to 12, an aspirant received the first 3 implants together, forming the physical foundation of the enhanced body. First came the secondary heart, also called the maintainer, which connects directly into the blood system, boosting blood supply and pumping ability. If the primary heart ever fails in battle, the secondary heart takes over completely, keeping the warrior alive and fighting. It also pumps stimulants and adrenaline into the system during intense combat, giving the warrior a surge of energy when he needs it most. This first implant was considered the simplest and most self-sufficient of all 19. But it set the foundation for everything that followed, because many later organs depended on the increased blood flow it provided. Alongside the maintainer came the organ that reshaped the warrior's skeleton from the inside out. The os medulla, known as the iron heart, was a tiny organ placed next to the pituitary gland at the base of the brain. It releases a specially engineered form of human growth hormone that, when combined with a diet heavy in calcium and ceramic-based minerals, causes the skeleton to grow rapidly in size and density. Over roughly 2 years, the candidate's bones thicken and harden until his ribcage fuses into a single solid plate, forming a natural shield around the vital organs dense enough to stop bullets. This fused ribcage provided tremendous protection, functioning almost like a permanent bulletproof vest, though it also made chest surgery extremely difficult for apothecaries who later needed to operate on a wounded warrior. By the time the Iron Heart finished its work, the candidate stood between 7 and 8 feet tall, though some grew even larger depending on their genetic line. Working alongside the second was the Biscopia, called the Forge of Strength, a small organ placed in the chest cavity. It releases hormones that drive massive muscle growth throughout the body, granting superhuman strength and endurance. The book Adeptus Astartes confirmed that these first 3 implants, the Maintainer, Ironheart, and Forge of Strength, could all be introduced at the same time, turning a skinny teenager into a towering figure of dense bone and thick muscle within a few years. Around age 12 to 14, the aspirant went back under the knife for 2 more implants. The hemastamen, also known as the blood maker, was placed into a major blood vessel such as the aorta. It alters the chemical composition of the warrior's blood, making red blood cells far more efficient at carrying oxygen and nutrients for the muscle. Without this organ keeping the other implants in balance, the growth hormones from the Ironheart and Forge of Strength could cause runaway bone and muscle development that would tear the body apart from the inside. The result was blood that was noticeably brighter and more vibrant than a normal human's, reflecting its improved oxygen capacity. Paired with the blood maker came the organ that made the Angels of Death appear nearly impossible to kill. Lerman's organ, called the Healer, was about the size of a golf ball and shaped like a small liver. It sits in the chest and produces special cells, called Lerman cells, that rush through the bloodstream to any injury site and form instant scar tissue, sealing the wound in seconds. A wounded warrior could lose an entire limb, and his body would seal the injury before the blood had time to flow freely, making a bandage or clamp completely unnecessary. This rapid healing was one of the main reasons these warriors took wound after wound and kept standing. Injuries that would have been fatal to an ordinary soldier were closed and sealed before they could do any lasting damage. Up to this point, every implant had changed what the warrior's body could do. The next one began changing what his mind was allowed to be. At around 14 to 17 years old, the aspirant revealed the 6th implant, the catalepsian node, called the Unsleeping. Placed at the back of the brain, it allows a battle brother to go without sleep for extraordinary periods of time by shutting down parts of the brain one at a time, letting each section rest while the others stay active, similar to how certain species of sharks and dolphins function in the wild. A warrior named Kion of the Thousand Suns stated in the Black Legion novel that a battle brother could survive on mere hours of rest per week and were capable of long periods without it entirely, though with a strain upon their bodies. In a separate case, Kion himself stayed awake for 13 consecutive days due to nightmares before finally collapsing. The longest recorded stretch any battle brother stayed awake on active duty was a staggering 328 hours, achieved by a squad of Crimson Fists fighting off an orc assault. Crucially, the unsleeping was paired with the beginning of hypno-indoctrination, the mental reshaping process that would later complete the transformation from person to weapon. This pairing was not a coincidence. The catalepsian node was needed to fully use the hypnomat machines that drove the mental training process, which is why the two were introduced at the same stage of development. Phases 7 through 9 were typically done together at the same age. The preomnor, known as the neutralizer, was a predigestive stomach placed above the original stomach. It houses a large database of all known toxic elements and analyzes everything the warrior eats in real time, breaking down poisons and filtering out harmful substances before they can reach the rest of the body. On dangerous worlds where no safe food existed, a battle brother could eat almost anything and pull enough nutrients from it to keep fighting. Dangerous compounds that the neutralizer could not destroy were stored in a chamber within the organ where they could either be expelled or sent to another implant for use as a weapon. Next came one of the strangest organs any warrior would ever receive. The omophagia, called the Remembrancer, is placed in the upper spinal cord and connects to the central nervous system. It absorbs genetic information, including DNA, RNA, and protein sequences related to experience or memory from anything the warrior eats. By consuming the flesh of an enemy or a native creature, he could gain knowledge about the local environment, learn survival skills, access fragments of memory, and even uncover secrets the enemy had tried to hide. In practice, this often took the form of bright visions or flashes of data that the warrior's mind had to interpret. Some orders built entire traditions and rituals around this organ, while others, like the Flesh Terrors, developed a deep cultural connection to the act of consuming enemy flesh. Several brotherhoods had lost the use of this implant entirely over the centuries due to gene seed decay. Alongside these came a third lung that turned the warrior into a self-contained survival machine. The multi-lung, also known as the imbiber, connects to the breathing and blood systems and allows a battle brother to pull oxygen from air too thin or too poisonous for normal human lungs. In dangerous environments, a mechanism seals off the standard lungs and channels all the breathing through this third lung, which filters out harmful substances while keeping full oxygen absorption. It also served the secondary purpose of absorbing more oxygen from normal air than two lungs alone could manage, further feeding the warrior's massive muscles. These gene-forged warriors were estimated to carry roughly 705 pounds of muscle outside their armor, and all that muscle demanded a constant, enormous supply of oxygen to function. By this point in the transformation, the candidate was near the full height and build of a fully enhanced warrior. Implants 10 and 11 sharpened his senses. The oculobe, called the Eye of Vengeance, was placed in the brain and connected to the optic nerves and retina, granting enhanced low-light vision and visual clarity that made darkness an advantage rather than a problem. Lyman's ear, the Sentinel, replaced the internal structures of one of the original ears, providing improved hearing, the ability to filter out unwanted sounds or focus on specific noises, strong protection against sound-based attacks, and total immunity to dizziness, motion sickness, and loss of balance, abilities that were critical during high-speed combat and rapid deployment assaults where a moment of confusion could mean death. At around 15, the aspirant received the Susan membrane, the Hibernator. Placed in the brain, it lets a badly wounded warrior go into a kind of deep rest, slowing the body's functions almost to a full stop. This was an absolute last resort, because activating it left the warrior completely helpless and unable to defend himself. Waking up required chemical treatment and guided suggestions from a medical officer with no guarantee of success. A warrior named Silas held the record for the longest time spent in this state at 506 days, though some sources suggested even longer periods were possible. Learning to activate the Hibernator took years of training and chemical therapy, and even then, triggering it without conscious thought during a moment of extreme injury was extremely difficult. The aspirant also received melanochrome, a black half-sphere placed inside the body that monitors radiation levels and adjusts the color of the warrior's skin as needed. Under intense sunlight or high radiation, the skin darkens to provide protection. This organ explained the physical differences between certain brotherhoods. The salamanders had coal-black skin because their homeworld produced so much radiation that the melanochrome stayed permanently at its highest output, while the Raven Guard suffered a defect that caused their organ to produce too little protection, leaving them unusually pale. If a warrior from a different order lived on a radiation-heavy world long enough, he would develop the same dark skin. Also at this stage came the oolitic kidney, the purifier, a red-brown heart-shaped organ that filters toxins from the blood. When paired with the secondary heart and triggered through training, a battle brother could purge his entire system of poisons at will, but the danger was that this cleaning process knocked the warrior unconscious, making it a risky option during active combat. The Neuroglottis, the Devourer, could be placed at the same time, sharpening the sense of taste and smell far beyond human levels, allowing a warrior to detect trace amounts of poison in food, identify chemicals by taste, and even track targets by scent with the sensitivity of a trained hunting dog. The Mucranoid, the Weaver, placed in the lower intestine, came around 16 years old. It releases hormones that change the warrior's sweat, making it thick and oily to help protect against extreme temperatures. It could also combine with the Hibernator to form a thick, shell-like layer that can stay intact even in space. This organ reportedly saved the life of Astarion Moloch, the legendary master of the Minotaurs, when he was badly wounded on a Necron warship and thrown into the void, surviving long enough for his warriors to recover him. At 17 came Becher's gland, the Poison Bite, a pair of modified glands placed in the mouth that turn a warrior's spit into a burning acid. This had uses beyond combat. A captured battle brother could, given enough hours, shoot through metal chains or bars to escape. One famous example involved the legendary warrior Andred-Har, who, when imprisoned by the Sons of Horus in chains that resisted his acid spit, simply dissolved the floor beneath his bonds instead, then broke free and killed his captors. Between the ages of 16 and 18, the aspirant received the most important organ any battle brother would ever carry, and the one that made the entire system possible. The progenoid glands, often referred to simply as the gene seed themselves, were placed in both the neck and the chest. Over time, these glands absorb the genetic material of every other implant in the warrior's body, storing and growing it until it is ready for harvest. The neck gland reached full growth after roughly 5 years and could be safely removed through a standard procedure with no ill effects. The chest gland took approximately 10 years to develop and was typically only recovered after the warrior died, because reaching it required major surgery. Each harvested gland contained enough genetic material to create a full set of implants for a new recruit, meaning that in a perfect cycle, one warrior could produce 2 replacements. This harvesting was one of the primary duties of the apothecary on the battlefield, because every lost gland represented a future battle brother who would never exist. Creating this genetic material from scratch had been a lost art for thousands of years. The only way to produce new implants was to harvest them from living or dead warriors, making the apothecary's battlefield role one of the most critical in any brotherhood. When a warrior fell in combat, the medical officer's first duty was not to mourn, but to extract the progenoid glands before the body was lost. Most orders also maintained a reserve of stored material, either harvested from living warriors or left over from the time of the Great Crusade. Each brotherhood was required to pay a share of roughly 5% of its genetic stock to the Adeptus Mechanicus, the technological priesthood of Mars, which sat on a massive reserve drawn from all known chapters, to be used in emergencies or for the creation of new brotherhoods during a founding. The 19th and final implant was the one that turned a modified human into something else entirely. The black carapace, called the interface, was a layer of dark, fibrous organic material surgically placed beneath the skin of the torso. Once in place, it hardens into a shell, and nerve-linked fibers grow inward to connect with the warrior's central nervous system. Trained apothecaries then inserted connection points into the carapace, which plugged directly into the systems of power armor. This neural link allows the armor to function as a true extension of the warrior's body, responding to thought as naturally as his own limbs. Other Imperial warriors like the Sisters of Battle and some Inquisitors could wear power armor, but without the carapace, they lack the direct neural link and receive less protection and less control. Unlike the other 18 implants, the interface could be built from scratch and did not require progenoid material to create. Together, these 19 implants created a warrior who was faster, stronger, tougher, and more durable than any natural-born human. He could breathe poison, survive in the emptiness of space, heal from wounds that would kill an ordinary soldier in seconds, and fight for days without sleep. But this system, as remarkable as it was, had never been meant to last forever without consequences. 10,000 years of constant copying had introduced errors and mutations into many bloodlines, and the damage was getting worse with each passing century. The Raven Guard had suffered critical damage to their gene stock. The Imperial Fists lost the function of multiple implants, and during the Curse founding, attempts to fix these problems produced brotherhoods with mutations so extreme that some of them stopped being anything recognizable as human. The Imperium had built a system meant to last forever, and that system was beginning to fail. But before the long decay could become a crisis, the warriors it created still needed to survive a process even more brutal than the implants themselves. Chapter 3: Trials of Survival. The Imperium of Man did not search for worthy candidates and lift them up. It threw thousands of children into a system designed to destroy the weak, and the handful who survived were the ones allowed to continue. Becoming a battle brother began long before any surgery took place. It began on worlds where survival itself was a daily test, and it continued through trials so brutal that most young hopefuls never lived to see the operating table. The Brotherhoods built their home bases on what the Codex Space Marines described as harsh or otherwise deadly worlds, and they did this on purpose. If the people living on these planets were already fighting for their lives every single day, then the children born there would be physically harder and mentally tougher than children from safer places. The planet itself had already done most of the work of sorting the strong from the weak long before the Order ever arrived to select its recruits. Each Brotherhood chose its world for a specific reason, and each world produced a specific kind of fighter. Iron Hands allowed constant resource wars between clans on Medusa, using the endless conflict to test who deserved to survive. Salamanders recruited from the volcanic world of Nocturne, where the population lived between eruptions and rivers of molten rock. White Scars favored the hunting tribes of the wild world Chagoris, where the instinct to track and kill was built into daily life. Recruitment worlds fell into several broad categories. Feral worlds were wild, untamed places where technology had barely advanced beyond basic tools, and the people living there often worshipped the angels of death as sky gods or star warriors. Hive worlds were massive urban nightmares, towering cities stacked one on top of another and crawling with crime, pollution, and violence, where only the most cunning and hard fighters caught the eye of a Brotherhood's recruiters. Feudal worlds were stuck in a state of medieval warfare, dominated by noble warlords and endless battles between kingdoms. Death worlds were so hostile that the Imperium itself considered them too dangerous for widespread settlement. And civilized planets, with their advanced societies and organized militaries, produced the rarest recruits of all, because the softer lifestyle meant fewer people possessed the raw hardness needed to endure the transformation, though those few who did rise from these places often brought a sharpness of mind shaped by organized training. No matter where a candidate came from, the selection was merciless. Every young male put forward had to be from a planet or society considered genetically clean. The Order's apothecaries and chaplains did not just look for physical strength or fighting ability. They hunted for something even rarer: genetic purity. Every candidate was closely checked to make sure he was free from any genetic flaws or unwanted changes. Spiritual health also had to be confirmed, because the Imperium's war against chaos was fought within the mind as much as on the battlefield. Only those with the purest minds, free from any sign of dark influence, were allowed to move forward. Across the Imperium, being chosen for recruitment was the highest honor a family could receive. Families of selected boys were treated with enormous respect, and the event could be remembered for generations through statues, paintings, songs, and stories. But from another angle, the honor was bittersweet. In all likelihood, the family would never see the boy again, and there was a very high chance he would die during the process that followed. Once identified, candidates were subjected to trials designed and overseen by their future brotherhood. Blood duels were among the most common, deadly fights between groups of recruits where only the strongest survived, proving their worth in the most direct way possible. On planets haunted by dangerous beasts or alien threats, hopefuls were sent to hunt these dangers, flipping the usual order and turning the prey into the hunter. On war-torn regions, whether the clash of swords on a feudal planet or the street fights of a hive city, the Order might simply observe from a distance, identifying the greatest fighters without ever revealing their presence. Exposure trials were a favorite on barren or deadly landscapes, sending young hopefuls into the harshest environments with little more than the clothes on their backs. Surviving alone in a predator-filled jungle or crossing a vast frozen wasteland with minimal supplies tested pure willpower and the refusal to die. Some of these trials were deliberately impossible to complete, with the assessors simply watching to see who lasted the longest or traveled the farthest before death or collapse. Brotherhoods like the Ultramarines and Space Wolves were known to favor these kinds of exposure trials. Orders that valued spiritual and mental strength as much as physical power favored knowledge of self trials. These forced the hopeful to face tests of inner strength, enduring terrible visions and powerful temptations designed to measure willpower. A librarian might use psychic powers to force nightmares directly into the recruit's mind, pushing him to confront the worst parts of his own nature. The stress and trauma of these tests often cause physical damage as well, making them a trial of both mind and body. The Imperial Fists were known to take this further with a device called the Pain Glove, which hooked into the recruit's nervous system and forced horrific pain while keeping him conscious far past what a normal person could handle. The result was either a mentally hardened individual or a complete mental breakdown and death. Some brotherhoods threw recruits into pitch-black caverns and forced them to find their way out using nothing but their instincts. Challenge trials were among the rarest and most dangerous, pitting the hopeful against a fully armored battle brother in single combat, a task that seemed impossible by every measure. The test was not about winning, but about how the young fighter approached the challenge, whether he showed courage, creativity, and the refusal to quit, even in the face of certain defeat. In extremely rare cases, a candidate actually managed to beat the challenger, an event so unlikely that such individuals usually went on to become legendary heroes of the Order. The novel Dante provided the most detailed account of what the selection process looked like for one specific brotherhood. On the moons of Baal, the sons of Sanguinius drew their recruits from radiation-blasted wastelands of gray sand and salt deserts where human life was short and harsh. Inhabitants often suffered from underdeveloped growth, blood-red sores, and cancers caused by constant exposure to the poisoned environment. The winged Primarch had left these moons in this ruined state on purpose, so that the children who grew up there would be hard enough to become warriors of the Blood Angels. Their selection was called the Time of Challenge, and it happened once in a generation during a period known as the Duplus Lunaris, or High Summer. Youths from across the moons had to travel hundreds of miles across open desert and salt flats just to reach the selection ground, and many died of thirst, exposure, spider bites, or venomous wildlife before they ever arrived. Those who made it faced a trial called Angel's Leap, where they had to build wings from leather and bone and fly across a canyon 5,000 feet deep, fighting through deadly winds and predatory birds called blood eagles that smash hopefuls out of the sky. At the place of choosing, a sanguinary priest and a chaplain carried out the first winnowing, using genetic scanning devices to check each survivor for biological match with the Brotherhood's gene seed. Those found lacking were sent home or taken as blood thralls, servants who would spend their lives supporting the sons of Sanguinius without ever becoming warriors. Secondary trials took place in a crater fortress deep in the desert, and they were designed to break everyone who had survived the journey. These included 9 days of physical competitions, followed by a 9-day force march through the desert without rest or enough water. Then came the winnowing of weariness. Candidates sat for 3 days and 3 nights in total silence and total stillness without sleeping, and if a candidate's head even dropped, he was dragged away and never seen again. What followed was the Trial of War, which forced hopefuls into groups and made them fight to capture a skull totem in a contest where killing fellow candidates was expected. But then came a test that flipped everything, the test of Horus. In this trial, a hopeful was ordered to kill a friend in order to secure his place among the sons of Sanguinius. The correct answer was to refuse the order. The test revealed whether the candidate had a moral center strong enough to resist the pull of power and needless killing, a quality the Blood Angels considered critical after the betrayal that had scarred their brotherhood's history. For the Order, the final stage was the Ritual of Insanguination. Surviving candidates drank from the Red Grail, which contained the mixed blood of the Order's priests and the Winged Primarch. Then, unlike most other brotherhoods who placed their implants one at a time over a period of years, they inserted all organ seeds at once. Young candidates were sealed inside metal coffins for an entire year while the transformation took place, raging and thrashing inside their containers, reliving genetic nightmares and the memories of their father. Some emerged successfully, others came out as crazed, mindless creatures and had to be killed on the spot. Other orders had their own methods, each reflecting their unique culture. Salamanders required every scout to hunt and kill a giant fire-breathing lizard in the mountains of Nocturne before being accepted as a full battle brother. Black Templars did not keep a standard scout company at all. Instead, hopefuls had to survive a series of crushing trials of strength, skill, and faith in the Order's outposts until a full battle brother was impressed enough to take them as a personal student. Across every brotherhood, the one constant was death. The implantation process was described as long and sometimes fatal, and the training that came with it had a shockingly high loss rate. One account described 30 boys taken from a single hive world, only 3 of whom survived to become full battle brothers, a 90% loss rate. During the months of shaping, hundreds of recruits died with each new wave, their bodies left in unmarked graves. The system was not designed to save the largest number of candidates. It was designed to guarantee that only the strongest, most tough, and most genetically matched survived. Physical training escalated day by day. Recruits ran mountain circuits with increasing difficulty, first unencumbered, then with weighted packs strapped to their backs, and then in primitive armor. Failure to complete the circuit by midday meant no food. Failure on the 3rd day meant removal from the program. Combat training began with wooden staves and bare hands before progressing to actual weapon. And throughout it all, the trainers beat weakness and compassion out of the candidates with equal force. Even those who made it through the biological transformation were not yet ready for war. The surgery was only half the process. The young warrior's mind had to be completely taken apart and rebuilt. Physical changes were backed by hypnotic suggestion, prolonged meditation, and psychological and spiritual testing. The mental reshaping process, called hypno-indoctrination, used machines called hypnomats that connected directly to the candidate's brain through painful connectors that pierced the skin. Visions flooded directly into the mind, the history of the Imperium, the glory of the master of mankind, the dangers of the alien, the mutant, and the heretic. Battle plans, weapons knowledge, and chants of hate and devotion poured in like a flood that threatened to drown the candidate's sense of self. Hypno-indoctrination was the single thing that separated a space marine from any other enhanced human. It smothered emotions under a thick, heavy blanket, buying fear, doubt, and hesitation so deep that only the most extreme grief or rage could ever push through. What remained was loyalty, hatred of the enemy, and a sense of duty so total that the warrior no longer thought of himself as a man, but as a weapon. Some surgeries were performed while the candidate was fully conscious and paralyzed, able to feel every cut, but unable to scream or pass out. A chaplain would stand nearby reciting chants of strength and endurance while the apothecary worked. Whether these words were for the candidate's benefit or simply ritual, the patient could not tell through the haze of agony. For the Blood Angels, mental reshaping took a specific form. Surviving candidates abandoned their birth names entirely and took on new identities called angel names, told that memories of their previous lives would fade over time, and that this was necessary. To control the genetic curses now living in their blood, the young warriors were taught the 5 angelic graces: focus, humility, mercy, restraint, and forgiveness. These were not taught through lectures alone, but practiced through art, through sculpting, painting, and fine lettering. Disciplines designed to give the warrior's mind a tool strong enough to hold back the monster in his blood. After months or years of implantation, mental reshaping, and training, surviving candidates were assigned to their Brotherhood Scout Company. As scouts, they learned the arts of stealth, observation, and combat under the guidance of veteran sergeants, carrying lighter weapons and wearing lighter armor while serving as the eyes and ears of the Order on the battlefield. Only after proving themselves in real combat, not training exercises but actual war, were they granted the right to receive the final implants, including the Black Carapace, and to wear the full power armor of a battle brother. Hopefuls who survived trials but failed to be selected faced different fates. Some, in extremely rare cases, returned to their home communities, where they were not considered failures, but respected as strong individuals who often went on to become leaders in the Imperial Guard or Planetary Defense Force. Others were taken as Brotherhood serfs, loyal servants who spent their lives caring for a warrior's armor and weapons. Those who broke the Order's laws during training faced harsher outcomes, not expulsion, but mind scrubbing and forced conversion into mindless mechanical slaves, or at best, demotion to the lowest level of service. The day a warrior received his power armor was the day the boy he had once been truly died. Armor was sealed to his body piece by piece in a ceremony that could take hours, each component blessed and checked before being attached to the carapace interface. When the helmet was placed and the seals locked, the world changed. The armor systems came online, flooding the warrior's awareness with data, environmental readings, and squad status. The man who had entered the ceremony was gone. What remained was a space marine. From a child in a harsh world to a fully armed battle brother, the entire journey was a system of planned destruction, designed not to find the best candidates, but to eliminate everyone who was not good enough. The Imperium called them heroes, but the truth was that they were products of a machine that consumed children and produced weapons. But even this machine, as merciless and efficient as it was, could not prevent what happened when the weapons it produced were gathered together in numbers large enough to threaten the Imperium itself. And that was exactly what happened during the greatest disaster the galaxy had ever known. Chapter 4: Divided to Prevent Rebellion. The machine that built them was brutal enough, but the true danger was what happened when those weapons were gathered together under a single command. For most of the Great Crusade, the Astartes were organized into massive armies called legions, each one tens of thousands strong, each one led by a single Primarch with absolute authority over his fighters. This structure allowed the Imperium to conquer the galaxy at an extraordinary pace, bringing world after world under human control in a campaign that spanned centuries. But it also created a single, terrible weak point. If a Primarch turned against the Master of Mankind, his entire legion turned with him. The Horus Heresy was the single greatest disaster in the history of the Imperium, and it proved that the legion system was a weapon that could be aimed in any direction, including back at the throne. War began when the War Master, the most trusted son and commander-in-chief of the Imperium's military, turned to the dark gods of chaos. Fully half of the Primarchs and their legions followed him into rebellion, turning their godlike power against the very civilization they had been built to expand. The conflict reached its peak at the Siege of Terra, where the traitor War Master was finally killed, but at a terrible cost. The Master of Mankind was mortally wounded and had to be placed on the Golden Throne, a life support machine that kept him suspended between life and death for the next 10,000 years. What made this scale of destruction possible was the sheer size of the legions and the bonds that held them together. The book Know No Fear provided concrete numbers for just how large these forces were. Before the breakup, the 13th Legion alone, the Ultramarines, consisted of at least 25 chapters within its overall structure. When 20 of those mustered together for a single operation at the world of Kolth, they fielded 200,000 warriors. The saying of the time captured their overwhelming power. To take a town, send a single warrior. To take a city, send a squad. To take a world, send a company. To take a culture, send a chapter. A single legion possessed enough military might to conquer entire star systems, and the heresy proved it also possessed enough power to nearly end the human species. Danger went beyond simple numbers because the internal bonds within each legion creates a system of loyalty that existed apart from the official command structure. Secret brotherhoods called warrior lodges had been introduced into the legions, creating a web of personal loyalty that connected warriors of all ranks and bonds that had nothing to do with their official duties. Many of the Battle Brothers, especially those in the 16th Legion, bore a physical resemblance to their Primarch, and those who looked most like Horus were considered lucky and often promoted faster. This personal connection meant that when the leader fell to chaos, his warriors did not resist. They had already been pulled toward him by something deeper than orders. Beyond the lodges, informal governing bodies further concentrated power. The War Master's inner circle, known as the Mournival, was a group of 4 captains who acted as the soul of the Legion, serving as his primary advisors and carrying out his will across the entire force. The source, Horus Rising, described how the War Master used these trusted captains as war dogs, deploying them to deliver rebukes or handle political problems so that he could remain a kindly peacemaker in the eyes of the wider Imperium. This meant that even before the rebellion began, the 16th Legion's real power rested not in its formal structure, but in the personal relationships that surrounded its leader. Even individual corruption could cause terrible damage within a legion. Case of Xavier Jabal, a decorated captain who became vulnerable to the warp because of internal anger and weaknesses in his mind, showed what happened when even one warrior fell. Jabal was transformed into a demon and turned on his own brothers with unthinkable strength, providing early evidence that the forces of chaos could use even a single warrior as a weapon against his own comrades. The full cost of misdirected loyalty became clear at the Dropside Massacre on Istvan V. 7 legions were sent to put down the rebellion, but 4 of them, the Wordbearers, Night Lords, Iron Warriors, and Alpha Legion, had already secretly committed to the traitor side. They used their massive numbers to trap the loyalist Raven Guard, Salamanders, and Iron Hands in a killing field, resulting in the near total destruction of 3 entire legions in a single engagement. This proved beyond any doubt that concentrated legion power in the hands of a traitor could end the Imperium in hours. The novel The First Heretic revealed an even more disturbing layer to this problem. The 17th Legion's gene seed had been intentionally designed with what the source called a minor engineered change, a tweak to brain chemistry that created unbreakable loyalty to their Primarch, Lorgar. This was not an accident or a corruption that happened over time. It was built into their biology from the beginning. When Lorgar led his warriors into worship of the Chaos Gods, every one of them followed without hesitation, because they were physically unable to do otherwise. Their loyalty was not a choice, but a chemical reaction. This same legion provided the most extreme example of what happened when genetic material was intentionally twisted. Warriors known as the Galvor Back carried 2 souls inside a single body, their own, and a growing demon nesting within them. This was presented not as a failure of the genetic template, but as what the Legion called truth, discovered during their forbidden journey into the warp. The material that had been designed to create loyal warriors could, under the right conditions, become a vessel for something no longer human. At Calth, the 17th Legion attacked the 13th Legion under the cover of what was supposed to be a peaceful joint operation. The publication Know No Fear described this as a precondition of malice, where a supposed ally used their full Legion strength to commit unimaginable violence while pretending it was all an accident. Even Chaos itself had infected the 13th Legion systems during the assault. A demonic presence called Samus broadcast its voice through the communications channels, telling the warriors that it was all around them and would gnaw on their bones. Betrayal had reached into the very technology that the legions depended on. In the wake of this destruction, one Primarch took it upon himself to make sure nothing like this could ever happen again. Rabude Gilliman, the Lord of the Ultramarines, was described in the Unremembered Empire as a man of theory and structure. Someone with an ordered mind who believed that any plan, no matter how good, needed a backup. During the heresy itself, when he was cut off from Terra and feared the Emperor was already dead, The 13th Legion's Primarch established what he called Imperium Secundus on the world of McCrag, a literal backup empire with its own government and administration, built from the broken remains of shattered legions. This experiment in rebuilding from broken pieces directly shaped his later reforms. Even on McCrag, the dangers of concentrated Primarch power were on display. Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter, was loose in the fortress city, using terror and destruction as weapons, and proving that a single wayward Primarch could rip apart a stronghold from the inside, no matter how well defended it appeared. After the heresy ended, the Lord of Ultramar poured everything he had learned into a single document, the Codex Astartes. Its most disputed and most important order was the permanent breakup of the massive legions into smaller, independent brotherhoods called chapters. This reorganization, known as the Second Founding, reshaped these warriors forever. Each old legion became a single chapter bearing its original name, and the remaining warriors were divided into many new successor orders. Rules were strict and non-negotiable. Each brotherhood was limited to exactly 1,000 battle brothers. Each was responsible for its own recruitment, training, and equipment, and each operated from its own homeworld or fortress monastery, spread across the galaxy to act as independent defenders of the Imperium. By splitting the legions apart, the Primarch of the 13th Legion made sure that betrayal could never again sweep through an entire army of tens of thousands. If a Brotherhood master turned traitor, his power was contained. 1,000 warriors, no matter how dangerous, could not bring down the Imperium the way 200,000 had nearly done. The Lord of Ultramar believed his warriors excelled at warfare because they had been designed to excel at everything, including leadership and governance. That was precisely the danger. Warriors built to be the best at everything were also capable of being the best at rebellion, which is why he also established core genetic banks on Terra itself, storing pure samples of gene seed that could be used for future foundings and returned to if a Brotherhood's genetic material began to drift too far from the original template. The new system traded overwhelming force for defense through separation, sacrificing the ability to gather an unstoppable army in exchange for the guarantee that no single betrayal could end everything. But the blood of the Primarch still flowed through every warrior, and that blood carried risks that no organizational chart could fully control. Those risks had already begun to show themselves in ways that even the Lord of Ultramar had not predicted, and they were getting worse with every passing millennium. Brotherhoods were divided to prevent rebellion, but the enemy that now threatened them was not a traitor war master, it was their own biology. Chapter 5. Flaws in the Blood. The Emperor had designed the Adeptus Astartes to be a stable, self-copying system. Gene seed was meant to produce the same result every time, generation after generation, brotherhood after brotherhood, for as long as the Imperium needed warriors. For a time, it worked. But 10,000 years of constant copying had introduced errors that no one planned for, and some orders now fought enemies that lived inside their own blood. The most well-documented case was the Blood Angels and their successors. The book, The Devastation of Baal, described two distinct curses carried by the sons of the Winged Primarch, and both had grown worse over the centuries. First was the Red Thirst, a biological craving for blood that pulsed at the edge of every Blood Angel's mind. The source described it as a monster in the breast, a red hum at the roots of thought. It was not a figure of speech, but a physical drive that came alive during combat, causing the warrior's canine teeth to extend, his reflexes to sharpen, and his mind to cloud with rage. The sons of Sanguinius attempted to manage the thirst through controlled consumption, drinking spiced wines laced with drops of fresh blood or consuming blood gruel, but the urge never fully went away. It sat beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when the warrior's control slipped. The graces they had been taught as recruits helped hold that craving at bay, but they were management tools, not cures, delaying the inevitable rather than preventing it. Far worse was the Black Rage, a psychological break where a warrior stopped being himself and began reliving the final moments of the Winged Primarch during the heresy. Those who fell to the rage lost their identity completely, shouting at enemies who had been dead for 10,000 years, seeing traitors where there were none. They were organized into the Death Company, their armor stained black with blood and soot to mark them as warriors who were already dead, sent into the most dangerous battles with no hope of return because there was no cure. Once the rage took hold, the warrior was gone, and the only service left for him was to die fighting. This weakness did not wait for veterans to age into it. It began claiming warriors from the very start of the transformation, those whose gene seed failed so badly during the blood change that they became animalistic, red-skinned things, were locked in the windowless towers of Amarillo, where they howled for blood and total darkness. Even warriors who served with honor for centuries were not safe. Extreme stress or powerful psychic disturbance could push a veteran who had held the rage at bay for decades over the edge in moments. When the Great Rift tore across the galaxy during a period called the Noctis Aeterna, when the Astronomicon itself was blotted out, hundreds of Blood Angels fell to the rage at the same time. The blow to the Brotherhood's strength was so severe that experienced veterans who had fought for centuries were lost in a matter of hours. The novel Dante showed the toll that time took even on those who resisted the curse. Commander Dante, the oldest living Astartes commander at roughly 1500 years, showed physical signs of aging that suggested the gene-forged design was not meant to last forever. His face carried deep wrinkles, his hair had turned white, and a warrior for whom war no longer fired his soul, a leader who felt the Imperium's end coming and struggled to find the strength to keep fighting against it. The sons of the winged Primarch were not the only ones affected. Curses had spread through the successor orders in different ways and to different degrees. The Flesh Terrors, led by Gabriel Seth, argued that the flaws were what defined them, describing his warriors as fury and the struggle against it, and claiming that without the fire of their Primarch's anger, the Angels of Death would lose what made them unique. But other successors had gone much further down the path of decay. The Knights of Blood were declared outcasts because they fully embraced their savagery, their leaders becoming monstrous, yellow-eyed creatures that needed to feed on human prisoners to stay sane. The crisis reached its peak during the devastation of Baal itself, when a massive Tyrannid invasion threatened to destroy the Blood Angels' home world. Commander Dante made the painful decision to send his Brotherhood's genetic legacy away from the planet during the battle, effectively accepting that if Baal fell, the future of the Sons of Sanguinius would die with it. Genetic flaws had touched Brotherhoods across the Imperium. The Imperial Fists had lost the function of both their Suzanne membrane and their Becher's gland. The Raven Guard suffered permanent damage to their gene stock from the sped-up harvesting methods used during the Heresy, leaving several of their implants non-functional. The Space Wolves carried their own inherited curse, a connection to their Primarch Leman Russ that could, under extreme stress, cause warriors to change into feral wolf-like creatures known as the Wolfen, losing their human minds entirely and becoming something closer to animals than soldiers. The worst attempt to fix these problems was the 21st Founding, known as the Cursed Founding. As recorded in the Codex Space Marines, this founding was specifically designed to correct long-standing biological defects through experimental changes. Instead, it produced orders with sudden and extreme mutations. The Flame Falcons, for example, were described as having turned into something neither human nor sane, and were ultimately destroyed or exiled. The Cursed Founding proved that trying to fix the genetic design could make things far worse rather than better, and it made the Imperium deeply cautious about any further attempts to alter the template. The Blood Angels themselves once had hope for a cure. During the Cryptus campaign, they sought a substance called the Satrix Elixir, believed to have the potential to ease or even eliminate the flaw, but every stock of this substance was lost when the entire Cryptus system was consumed by Tyrannids, and whatever chance existed for a biological solution disappeared with it. Yet, even in the darkest moments, there were signs of something that kept the Sons of the Winged Primarch fighting. The Sanguinor, a mysterious golden figure who appeared during moments of extreme crisis, had been known to steady the Brotherhood when the thirst or the rage threatened to overwhelm them, reportedly telling Commander Dante that there was yet hope. Whether this figure was a sign of Sanguinius' will, a psychic echo, or something else entirely, the sources did not say. But for an order defined by a struggle against its own blood, even the possibility of hope was enough to keep going. He had designed a system meant to last forever, but forever was a long time, when every generation of gene seed carried the growing errors of the generation before it. Some Brotherhoods had lost organs, some had gained curses, and some had turned into things that could no longer be called human. The design was breaking down, and the Imperium needed a solution before the decay reached a stage where recovery was impossible. That solution had been growing in secret for 10,000 years, waiting in hidden vaults beneath the surface of Mars, and the man who built it was about to change everything. Chapter 6: The Primaris Solution. His name was Belisarius Cawl, and he had been waiting for this moment since before the Imperium began to fall apart. The book Dark Imperium described Archmagos as a genius of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the technological priesthood of Mars, whose intellect had no equal in the 41st millennium. Following the heresy and the mortal wounding of Rabute Gilliman, the master of the project received a hidden order to improve upon the original super soldier design. While the rest of the Imperium spent 10,000 years fighting, praying, and slowly declining, Cawl worked in hidden vaults on Mars, using every resource he could find to engineer a new generation of warriors who would be stronger, faster, and more physically tough than any battle brother who had come before. The result was not a small improvement, but a complete rethinking of the Astartes template. The novel Belisarius Cawl: The Great Work provided a deeper understanding of the man behind the project. The Martian engineer was not a single mind in a single body, but a being made up of multiple fused personalities, carrying within him the memories and knowledge of several individuals, including Ezekiel Sedain, one of the original directors of the Space Marine project, who had worked under the Master of Mankind himself during the creation of the first Enhanced Warriors. This gave the architect of the Primaris project a unique advantage. He could bridge the gap between the original science and modern technology, combining ancient knowledge with 10,000 years of advancement. His stated motivation was not power, but the salvation of humanity and the desire to see the Imperium grow by purging the poison of chaos from its veins. Primaris transformation included all 19 of the original implants, but added 3 new organs that pushed the warrior's abilities to a new level. He also restored access to the full set of original implants, many of which had been lost or damaged in older brotherhoods over the millennia. Mutation rate in Primaris gene seed was reported at less than 0.001% per generation, a level of genetic stability that the older orders had not seen in thousands of years. At the same time, the master of the project argued that certain traits unique to specific gene lines, like the Blood Angel's red thirst, were part of the original vision and should not be completely removed, suggesting that some amount of controlled instability was built into the design on purpose. The first new organ was the sinew coils, also called the steel within. These were durametallic cables woven into the warrior's sinews, the tissue connecting muscle to the bone. They contract with tremendous force, boosting strength and adding a layer of physical hardness that went beyond what the original implants provided. An unarmored Primaris warrior could crush a man's skull with his bare hands, shatter body armor into pieces, and bite through metal cables, standing roughly 1.5 feet taller than their older brothers and carrying significantly more mass. The second new organ carried a connection to the Primarchs themselves. The Magnificat, known as the Amplifier, was a small, thumbnail-sized lobe inserted into the brain's cortex. It releases hormones that boost the body's growth functions, while also increasing the effects of the other organs, especially the Iron Heart and the Forge of Strength. What made the Amplifier especially significant was that it represented half of an organ known as the Godmaker gland, something the Master of Mankind had originally intended only for his Primarchs. Cawl attempted to recreate the full gland, but the other half of the research had been destroyed, either by its creator or by unknown parties. If the full organ had been successfully built, every Primaris warrior would have been something close to a small-scale Primarch. Even with only half the gland, Primaris warriors often reached 8 to 10 feet in height, with matching increases in bone and muscle weight. The third new organ was the Belisarian Furnace, called the Revitalizer. It connects to both of the Marines' hearts and lies inactive until the warrior suffers extreme, life-threatening damage. When activated, it releases a powerful chemical mix that triggers rapid regrowth of tissue, bone, and muscle, giving the warrior a short-term healing ability far beyond what standard Lehrman cells could provide. After use, the furnace required a long recharge period before it could activate again, making it a desperate last measure rather than something a warrior could count on. But the creation of these improvised warriors came with a cost measured in trust and political power. The Archmagos' first test subject, Alpha Primus, showed that cost. The novel described this unique first-version Primaris warrior as immensely powerful, even possessing strong psychic abilities, but living in constant, agonizing pain because the master of the project had pushed too far, attempting to match the achievements of the master of mankind and falling short. The book Genefather noted that Primus had a smeared rainbow aura visible to psychers, a sign that his spirit was not properly seated in his flesh, causing a spiritual discomfort that worsened during travel through the warp. Hall acknowledged that he had overreached with his first creation, but still considered him not a failed experiment, but a son. When Gilman was revived and launched the Indomitus Crusade, a 112-year campaign to push back the forces of chaos after the opening of the Great Rift, he used the new warriors as his primary weapon. The first wave was organized into vast gene-line armies called the Unnumbered Sons, also known as the Grey Shields, marked with a pale gray chevron over their badge, showing they had no formal brotherhood to call home. As the Crusade progressed, the revived Primarchs scattered these warriors across the galaxy, sending them to fill the ranks of weakened orders, like the size of the Emperor who had been nearly wiped out by the Hive Fleet Kraken, or to find entirely new ones. Political consequences were significant. Within the Mechanicus, the architect of the project was viewed by conservative groups, led by Fabricator General Ood Udia Raskian, as a dangerous innovator and an almost heretic for his willingness to improve upon the original work and use alien technology. Archmagos himself repeatedly asked, through a device called the Call Inferior, a forbidden thinking machine that served as his representative, to be named Fabricator General of Mars. The Lord of Ultramar denied this request every time, recognizing that granting that kind of political power would trigger a civil war within the priesthood of Mars. Even Gilliman, who depended on the new warriors for the survival of the Imperium, did not fully trust the man who had created them. He viewed Call as a secretive creature whose logic often pushed against the boundaries of what was acceptable, relying on the Primaris because the Imperium needed them, but keeping the man who built them at a distance, treating him as a necessary risk rather than a trusted partner. Introduction of these improved warriors also created a deep identity crisis within the Brotherhoods themselves. Veteran Firstborn warriors, those who had served for centuries with the original implants, suddenly found themselves standing next to warriors who were taller, stronger, and built on a genetic foundation that corrected flaws the older generation had carried their entire lives. Brotherhood Master Mancerius Thracian described the Firstborn as the past, while calling the new warriors the future. As the original generation continued to age and die, their unique gene seed was being stored in vaults, replaced by the standard Primaris stock. Existing Firstborn could actually receive the Primaris enhancements as an upgrade through a process called the Rubicon Primaris, allowing seasoned veterans to cross over to the new template and keep pace with the latest advances. But this did not ease the tension for many. Marneus Calgar of the Ultramarines himself felt humiliated by Gilliman's direct involvement in the Brotherhood's affairs, including adding officers like Captain Decimus Felix to the command structure without consulting the existing leadership. Felix, a Primaris warrior, was described as physically closer to the Primarchs in height and ability than any previous generation of these warriors, a living reminder of how much had changed. The Flesh Terror's Lord Commanders saw the Primaris not as salvation, but as a betrayal and replacement, fearing the new warriors were simply Ultramarines in red armor who carried the name of his brotherhood, but none of its true identity, none of the wrathful spirit that had defined them for thousands of years. Notably, not a single Primaris warrior had fallen to the Black Rage during the entire Indomitus Crusade, and many Primaris warriors were confused by the very concept of the Red Thirst, suggesting the new genetic template may have corrected the flaw at a biological level. For Seth, this was proof that the Primaris had erased the very thing that made his order what it was. Even the Archmagos himself acknowledged the human cost of what he had built, admitting that he would never have created the Primaris warriors if he had not believed it was absolutely necessary for the Imperium's survival. He had reflected that in building these weapons, he had effectively stolen the youth of boys like Felix, transforming them into tools of war before they had a chance to become anything else. The Primaris solution saved the Imperium, the Crusade pushed back the darkness, and the new warriors filled the gaps left by 10,000 years of loss and genetic decay. But the cost was still being counted. The Brotherhoods that Firstborn had built over thousands of years were being reshaped by warriors forged in Call's vaults rather than in the traditions of their fathers, and the warriors who had held the line for 10 millennia were watching their identity dissolve one replacement at a time. But whether the new warriors were truly Space Marines, or something altogether different wearing the same name, was a question that the Orders were only beginning to confront, and the answer depended on something no implant could measure: what it cost to be human in the first place. Chapter 7. No Longer Human. Whether firstborn or Primaris, whether forged in a Brotherhood's ancient traditions or grown in the vaults of Mars, every Space Marine had passed through the same fire. The transformation was complete. Implants had been accepted, training had been endured, and armor had been sealed. What remained was no longer the boy who had been taken from his home world, but a weapon shaped like a man, designed to defend a species he could no longer truly belong to. And it was this distance between what these warriors protected and what they'd become that defined the final cost of the Imperium's greatest creation. The first and most obvious measure of that distance was time. These warriors did not age the way humans did. Genetic changes extended their lifespans across centuries, sometimes far longer, and the longer they lived, the further they drifted from anything that looked like a normal human experience. The book Hell's Reach described the Reclusiarch Grimaldus as a veteran of 200 years of continuous warfare, whose mentor, Mordred, had served for nearly 4 centuries before falling in battle. When the apothecary reached the body, his first duty was not to mourn, but to extract the gene seed, the ritual of the fallen that kept the Brotherhood alive, even as individual warriors were unremembered and unburied. Commander Dante of the Blood Angels, at roughly 1500 years old, represented the extreme end of this lifespan, a warrior who had outlived every human institution on his home world many times over. The novel Spear of the Emperor provided further examples. Amadeus, Caius, and Carius of the Mentor Legion had served for almost a century. Castellan Zavarin Royst of the Black Templars was estimated to be 1 or 2 centuries old. On the strike cruiser Hex, a hall called a Barrow Deck contained statues and keepsakes honoring warriors who had been dead for centuries. Their stone likenesses were often covered with rough, affectionate insults scratched into the surface by surviving brothers, a humor born from shared war and shared loss that had no equivalent in the world outside the Order. But even a Battle Brother's body was not beyond breaking. Despite their physical hardness, the Gene-Forged warriors could be reduced to ruin. The Mentor Legion veteran only survived near total destruction by undergoing the Calgarian rites, a procedure that rebuilt his body using organs harvested from fallen brothers. Old warriors collected replacement parts, both biological and mechanical, until advancing age and excessive upgrades left them less than the standard they had once been. Among the Black Templars, a veteran named Cater was released from the elite Sword Brethren specifically because advancing age and too many mechanical replacements had reduced him below that standard. The legendary Dreadnoughts represented the extreme end of this, warriors so badly broken that they could only continue to serve by being sealed inside walking war machines, preserved in a state between life and death for centuries or even longer. Physical distance, however, was small compared to the mental and emotional gap that separated the Angels of Death from the humans they defended. The most consistent observation across the sources was that the Battle Brothers had lost the ability to relate to ordinary humans in any meaningful way. The Reclusiarch described the fierce smell of mortal soldiers, a mix of sweat, breath, and uncontrolled waste, as a foul musk that disgusted him. He struggled to feel sympathy for fleeing civilians, describing their cries as the screams of butchered animals. At one point, he admitted openly that he would never again understand the humanity he had left behind, that the way humans experienced the world remained alien to him. This was not cruelty, but the natural result of a process that had stripped away the parts of a person that connected him to other people. Hypno-indoctrination, mental shaping, and the sheer weight of centuries of war had left him unable to see ordinary humans as anything other than a species he was designed to protect, not as people he shared anything with. Human servants assigned to these warriors fared no better. The Mentor Legion veteran considered his human attendants to be nothing but tools, no different from his bolter or his blade. They were possessions, not people. The effect that the Battle Brothers had on ordinary humans was an effortless and unintentional arrogance and a brutal and knowing grace that shifted the behavior of everyone around them. In the world of Nemeton, the tribal people did not worship the Emperor's spears as gods. They viewed them with distant, cautious fear. Parents covered their sons' eyes as the warriors passed, and the order was received the way one would receive executioners. For warriors recruited from that world, becoming one of the Emperor's spears was not an honor in the traditional sense, but a form of exile. A warrior who joined the order was cast out of his clan and treated not as a man, but as a ghost, having sacrificed his name, his family, and his place in the community to become something useful, but no longer human. This separation was not accidental, but built into the culture of every brotherhood. The Battle Brothers did not live in human society. They existed within fortress monasteries, mobile warships, and isolated strongholds that worked as self-contained worlds of ritual and war. The Black Templar's vessel, the Eternal Crusader, was described as a princely fortress monastery filled with hanging banners from 10,000 years of crusading, supported by serfs who passed technical duties down through generations. The human support system that made all of this possible was vast and largely invisible. Within the Mentor Legion, families like the Dawes bloodline had served in this role for generations, living in regulated human habitation sectors and honoring their ancestors by wearing patchwork leather cloaks made from the processed skins of those who came before them, with their deeds recorded in careful writing on the flesh leather. These servants lived in the lowest levels of service, cold but never freezing, hungry but never starving, existing only to provide food paste and technical support to their masters. Below even them were the mindless machine slaves built into the ship's structure, living in coffin-sized wall sockets when not in use, and eating recycled gray meat until they were eventually used up and thrown away. This was the real face of the Imperium's greatest warriors, a culture that consumed human lives at every level, from the children who died during the trials, to the bonded laborers who lived and died in service, to the warriors themselves who had given up everything human in exchange for the ability to fight. The serfs were sometimes overheard discussing what the warriors had sacrificed. One serf in the novel wondered aloud what the warriors had lost to become what they were. Not just their bodies, but what was inside, the human part. A second serf warned that those were dangerous thoughts, reminding the first that the angels could hear more than most people realized. The ritual of arming was not a quick, technical procedure, but a ceremony layered with tribal chants and heartbeat drums designed to match the warrior's own pulse. Each piece of war gear was blessed and checked before being locked into place, and when the final seal closed, the warrior who had entered the chamber was buried beneath the machine that now carried him into war. The Battle Brothers viewed their role not as protectors of individual people, but as the weapons of the state. One warrior named Priamus argued that the Astartes were the spear thrust to the throat, not the blunt anvil, fighting not for the people of the Imperium, but for the Imperium itself. The defining creed of their existence was blunt. They were judged in life for the evil they destroyed. But the Reclusiarch, over the course of his own story, arrived at something slightly different. He came to understand that while the Battle Brothers were weapons, their value might lie not just in what they killed, but in what their sacrifice represented to the species they could no longer belong to. He concluded that they were judged not only for the evil they destroyed, but for the lessons and inspiration their sacrifice provided to humanity. A Space Marine was a hero, but only because he had given up every human part of himself to become one. A veteran sergeant in another account captured this in a more personal way. He told a newly elevated battle brother about encountering a father shielding his family during a compliance action, a man standing with his arms spread, as if he could somehow protect his children from a bolt round. There was no defiance in his stance, only desperate animal fear for his offspring. In that moment, the sergeant understood that this man, weak and mortal and significant in the great workings of the Imperium, possessed a courage born of love that no gene-forged warrior, for all his genetic enhancement and mental shaping, could ever truly understand. That was what they protected, not the Imperium as an idea or the distant figure on his gold throne, but humanity in all its flawed and unreasonable glory. Weapons required a purpose, and purpose was found not in the killing blow, but in what that blow protected. The Mentor Legion veteran reached a similar understanding, realizing that his entire identity, his rank, his name, his mission, all of it was a thing built by the Brotherhood. He understood that he had always been a soldier, an officer, a weapon, and had never truly had a choice. Humanity survived the darkness of the 42nd millennium, not because these warriors understood or loved the species they defended, but because these warriors had sacrificed their names, their families, and their very ability to be human, becoming instead the tools required to hold back extinction. Some ghost of the boy each warrior had once been still haunted the weapon he had become, but it would fade in time, lost beneath the weight of centuries of warfare and service. This was not a tragedy to be mourned, but simply the reality of what it meant to become one of the angels of death. The child was erased so the weapon could exist, and in the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war, weapons were the only currency of consequence. The Adeptus Astartes was not born as legends, they were engineered through sacrifice, discipline, and the steady removal of everything human. And in the endless war of the 41st millennium, that process of making and unmaking continued still. But for some warriors, the cost did not stop there. Watch the Death Watch's full story here to learn more about the dark corners of Warhammer 40k.